Hi everyone, I'm Jorge Fontan and I'm an architect in New York. Today I want to talk about certificates of occupancy. A certificate of occupancy is a document issued by the Department of Buildings that lists the legal use of a building or a house. A certificate of occupancy is also referred to as a CO or a C of O. These are issued after a building or a house is completed, the construction is 100% done, all the inspections have passed, all the paperwork has been completed, and there's nothing pending with the city. All items are finished. So let's just go through all the items that are included, and I'll give you a brief description. This is for a typical New York City certificate of occupancy. At the top of the certificate of occupancy, you're going to see the CO number or certificate of occupancy number. This will have a T or an F in it, T for temp, F for final, okay? We're going to get back to that in a minute. This is a unique number for your certificate of occupancy. Below that will be a statement telling you what a certificate of occupancy is. This certifies that the premises described herein conform substantially to the approved plans and specifications and to the requirements of all applicable laws, rules, and regulations for the uses and occupancies specified. No change of use or occupancy shall be made unless a new certificate of occupancy is issued. This document or a copy shall be available at the building for inspection at all reasonable times. This statement basically says that an architect has submitted plans to the Department of Buildings. They have been approved. It's been found compliant with the applicable codes and city regulations. It's been inspected, and you can now occupy your building. You can only occupy your building in accordance with the uses and stipulations within the certificate of occupancy. And if you intend to use the building in any way that contradicts the certificate of occupancy, or you intend to make any alterations to the building in any way that contradicts the certificate of occupancy, you will be required to get a new certificate of occupancy. And in New York City, this is done by filing an alteration type 1 application. So then on the certificate of occupancy, we're going to see a lot of general information. At the top in New York City, it'll list the borough, under that the address, and then the BIN number. The BIN number is the building information number. This is a specific number issued to your building that, so if you go to the Department of Buildings website in New York, on the BIS, which is the Building Information System, you can just pull up your BIN number and it has all the information for your specific building. Okay? Then it's gonna have the block and lot. This comes from the Department of Finance. Every block has a number, and then every lot within the block has a lot number. So that's the block and lot number. That's a very common way of identifying properties based on Department of Finance records. Okay, the building type will be listed. That is the type of building that the certificate of occupancy is being issued on. So the type of application that you filed. So did you file a new building application or an alteration application? So it's basically just going to say new or alt for alteration. Then the certificate type, F or T, I mentioned that before. So F for final, T for temporary. So if you finish the building or the house and there's just a few minor things that are not completed, maybe some paperwork issues that are holding you up or a minor issue, but the inspections are all done and they've all passed, the Department of Buildings can issue you a temporary certificate of occupancy, and these have to be renewed periodically. So if it has a T, that means it's a temporary, and if it has an F, it means it's a final. If it's an F, everything has been closed out. Sometimes you'll have multiple applications on a property, so you'll have a one application for the building and then separate applications for interior things, and those applications can hold you up. If the building has any violations, that'll hold you up from getting a final. So there's lots of reasons why you might actually get a temporary certificate of occupancy. It's very common. Those have to be renewed periodically. Okay, if it has a final or a temporary, it'll have an effective date, and if it's a temporary, it'll have an expiration date. Final certificates of occupancy do not have an expiration date. All right. Under that, you'll see this building is subject to this building code. For some reason, this isn't always filled out, I've noticed, on some certificate of occupancies that I've seen. But in New York City, we have historic codes, so the code is constantly being updated. So it'll list what was the applicable code at the time that the certificate of occupancy was issued, what code the building was reviewed under. Okay. And next would be meets and bounds, CBIS. So the meets and bounds is the outline of the property. There's a document called a PD1 in New York. This will have the meets and bounds on it. This is basically what's the outline, of the property. It's not listed on the Certificate of Occupancy, but you can find that in New York on the Building Information System. The next section on the Certificate of Occupancy is about the construction of the building. So you're going to see the construction classification. This is the type of construction used in the building. In New York City current codes, there's 5 types of construction classifications, 1 through 5. Most of them have an A and a B. So you might have a 1A construction or a 3B construction. This tells you the classification of the construction. Is it wood frame? Is it masonry? Is it steel? Okay, that's very important, and it tells you the construction classification determines fire rating requirements and things like that. So that'll be listed, as well as the applicable code based on the year. So was it 1968 code, or was it new 2014 code, or some other code that was applicable at the time? The construction classifications will vary based on if they're older codes. So I said it's 1 through 5 for the newer code, but older code had different designations. Okay. Under that will be the building occupancy group. Every building use will have a different occupancy group. This is in the building code. So residential has 3 groups, R1, 2, and 3. R1 is like a hotel, R2 is an apartment building, and R3 is a single or 2-family house, right? There's a lot of different groups. A is for a place of assembly, things like that. This will list the occupancy group. The occupancy group is very important. It tells you what codes are applicable. In the building code, there's lots of reference to occupancy group to tell you what applies in different situations. Obviously, different codes apply to a residential building than to a theater or to an office building. Under that, if it's a residential building, it'll have the multiple dwelling law designation. The multiple dwelling law, also known as the MDL, is a New York set of rules. It's laws about residential occupancy. So those are additional codes. That is beyond the building code. That is a separate set of laws outside of the New York City building code that you also have to comply with, and it'll list the designation. What type of multiple dwelling classification is it? After that, there'll be a little description of the building, how many stories. This is one that can be a little confusing sometimes because certain things count as a story and certain things do not. A mezzanine does not count as a story as long as you fall into the regulations for a mezzanine. A cellar does not count for a story, but a basement does. That'll list the number of stories. The height of the building will be listed. How many feet tall is the building? This is measured to the roof, not to bulkheads or things like that. And if it's a residential building, it'll list the number of dwelling units or rooming units. This is how many apartments do you have inside the building. If it's an apartment building, are there 200 apartments or 10 apartments? Okay. The next category will be the fire protection category, if any exist. So do you have a fire alarm in the building? Do you have fire sprinklers, a standpipe, any type of fire protection features that are required for your building? These all have to be inspected before you get a certificate of occupancy to verify that they all work properly. So all the fire protection features are listed on the certificate of occupancy, at least a modern certificate of occupancy. Under that, you'll have open spaces. There's a section for open spaces. This will vary based on buildings. Some buildings this will be blank on, but do you have outdoor parking? Do you have a plaza? Is it a restaurant with outdoor seating? Things like that. Any of those issues for outdoor spaces could potentially be listed on the certificate of occupancy. After open spaces, you'll have legal limitations on the building. Not all buildings are going to have legal limitations, but this could be something like a restrictive declaration or any kind of specific limitation. There's lots of reasons that you could have this. I'm not really going to go into that, but there could be potential legal limitations. You're going to have then a borough comments section. Okay, this is often not filled in, but the Borough of Department of Buildings that is issuing your certificate of occupancy can list comments here or anything that they want to state on your certificate of occupancy, but you'll notice that that's usually left blank. Now, of course, all these things we've been discussing so far have been for a new certificate of occupancy by today's standards. I've seen certificates of occupancy that are very old, that have very little information on them. This is a contemporary certificate of occupancy in New York. All right, then that's basically the first page of a certificate of occupancy. Certificate of occupancy can be many pages. If it's a single-family house, it might be 2 pages. If it's a high-rise building in Manhattan, it could be many pages. Even up to 10 or more pages. So after the first page, which is the general information, is the description of all the uses and all the floors in the building, okay? This is based off of a document called the PW1A or the Schedule A. This is done by an architect, okay? So the certificate of occupancy, actually most of the information comes from the architect, and this is reviewed by the Department of Buildings, but the architect determines the vocabulary and the wording that goes on, but they can get some assistance from the DOB when they're in the application process, okay? So you got to be very careful about wording if you are an architect when you fill these out, because I've seen some horrendous certificates of occupancy that are written so poorly, it is really hard to determine what they meant, and then you have kind of problems later on if you're trying to do an alteration. I've had a bunch of clients, we do a lot of renovations in New York City that have had problems because their certificate of occupancy is just written terribly, and the Department of Buildings is giving them a hard time, and then they want to kind of figure this out, and they want to do a renovation, but they don't believe they need to get a new certificate of occupancy, but it's hard to tell because it's written so confusing. Or sometimes people are trying to sell a property and the certificate of occupancy is just written so badly that it's hard to sell the property because of some confusion on what the legal use is. So when we write these, we want to be very careful. The whole point is to be clear and concise. Don't say anything you don't need to say, but just make sure that it clearly illustrates what the proposed use is for the building. Okay, so on the list of the building description, you're going to have a chart. This will state the floors throughout the building and all the spaces in the building. Okay, so you might have multiple different types of uses on one floor, so these might be listed on multiple lines for one floor, okay? These could be individual floors or floor ranges, so if you're doing a high-rise apartment building and floors 10 through 20 are all the same, you don't have to list every floor. They can be just floors 10 through 20, right? Or if it's an office building with a lot of repetition, you can have repetition and just do a floor range. So that's the first column. The second column is the maximum number of persons. The building code will determine how many people can occupy a space. There are formulas for this. So if you have a theater with seating, there's a calculation of how many seats you can legally have based on the square footage of the theater, okay? So that'll be listed on the certificate of occupancy. Then the next column will be the live load. This is the structural load designed for the building, okay, without calculating the actual structure of the building. So the live load is the load of people, it's the load of furniture, it's the load of things you put into the building, but it's not actually the weight of the building itself, that's separate. So if this is very important because it's how much weight the building is designed to hold. So if you're changing use, okay, the live load might not be acceptable. The building occupancy group is the next column, all right? So this is the occupancy group for that specific use, not necessarily the whole building. So you could have a mixed use building. For example, if you have retail on the first floor and you have residential above, you're gonna have different occupancy groups for the building. So these will be listed by floor. Every floor is gonna state what the occupancy group is. If it's a residential building, the next column would be dwelling or rooming units. This is going to list the number of apartments on that floor, okay? Or the number of rooming units, how many hotel rooms or dorm rooms you have. The next group is zoning use group. So the building occupancy group is based on the building code, and the zoning use group is based on the zoning resolution. These are two completely different things. People often get mixed up between building code and zoning code. They're completely isolated issues. You have to comply with both. The zoning use group will be a number assigned to every type of use, whether it's an apartment building or an office building or medical offices or something. They'll all have different use groups, and that'll tell you what applicable zoning codes and does the zoning allow that type of use in this particular zoning district. Okay, that's the zoning use group. After the zoning use group, there will be a description of use. This is really important. This is just a written description that I mentioned. The architect fills out the Schedule A, and this is just a brief and concise written description of the use of the building. So if you're building a single-family house, you might say, on the first floor, half of single-family home, and on the second floor, half of single-family home. Something very clear and concise. If you have a duplex apartment, you might say, half of one dwelling unit in conjunction with a dwelling unit on the, fourth floor or something, or whatever the case is. Okay, so this should be clear and concise. And sometimes, I've seen some certificate of occupancies that were a real mess, real difficult to understand. So this is really important. And that's what you just read through, and you can figure out what the legal use of your property is. And if you want to make changes, if you want to change the certificate of occupancy, you can, but this is a major process. And when you change the certificate of occupancy later, you may be surprised on all the upgrades required because different, as we mentioned, different zoning use groups, different building occupancy groups, different multiple dwelling law classifications all have different requirements. So your building might not be okay the way it is to change it later. You might have to do a lot of major alterations. Then the final section is what I just refer to as an additional information section. This is just any information that doesn't have a section will go here, okay? So if the property has an easement, which is the legal right of one person to use another property, that's one example of what might be in the additional information section. A lot of other things. There's a lot of Department of Finance paperwork that has to be done when you're building a new building. For example, zoning exhibits have to be filed, so the CRFN numbers can be listed in this section, which are the numbers issued by the Department of Finance for each document number. Okay, there could be any kind of special notes on the property, anything that doesn't have another place that needs to be listed in order to really explain the property. Any kind of reference to legal documents filed on the property that need to be referenced, will be in that section. This is all based on a modern certificate of occupancy in New York. Different cities will have different formats. Older certificates of occupancy in New York may also have different formats. Leave comments below, hit subscribe, hit the like button. Thank you for listening.